Mystery Twins by Lizzy 322. Disclaimer. No, I don't own GravityFalls. Any side characters were made up on the spot. La-di-da. Author's note. This story is an alternate universe. Mabel and Dipper are orphans/foster children who've bounced from home to home before ending up at the mystery shack of a certain con man. This will contain scenes and quick flashbacks of abuse, but nothing super graphic. Just warning. Also, I will not be held responsible for any intense amounts of feels that may attack you. Complaints go in the complaint box. Updates are sporadic, but I don't usually exceed a week without one. Enjoy! Chapter 1. Stan had never viewed himself as kid-oriented. Sure, he saw a few of them running around his shop. They roamed about occasionally, touching stuff that didn't belong to them, and crying about money and the scary statues that Stan constructed, along with other things that went in one ear and out the other with the seasoned businessman. But to care for a kid? Stan couldn't see himself doing it. His only knowledge about the little gremlins were that they slobbered, left toys everywhere, and cried endlessly. He was sure you probably fed them or something, but he couldn't say he had any type of first-hand experience, since Wendy was far from a child, and suits didn't count as a valid example. Stan never really wanted kids either. He didn't care for the settling down life with the dog and the white picket fence, because then he couldn't run from the feds. He had his job in the mystery shack, wringing money out of people, and enjoying life with a stack of bills in his suit pocket. So on that bright Sunday morning, the beginning of summer, he felt completely unprepared by the social worker showing up at his door, telling him he just got a case and had to prepare on getting used to another person in the house, eating his food, and probably breaking stuff.
"And are telling me this now?"
he'd argued, bearing only his white undershirt and striped boxers, a can of soda in one hand, and his cane in the other. His trademarked fez lay lopsided on his hair that seemed to grow whiter every day, and would probably be gone after this encounter. He wore what he liked to deem the mourning face, which probably explained the worker's uncomfortable look. The case worker shifted uneasily, lifting a page from her clipboard and sighing. "I'm sorry, Stanford, but these kids just got picked up last night. It was a long night of settling the matter and having nurses administer stitches to the boy. And we want them in a home as soon as possible. Even overnight if you'd really want. I just need some place to put them."
"I've never been picked,"
Stan grumbled, trying to recall any documents he'd found rummaging in the upstairs desk. A couple mortgage papers, some weird certificates, a couple crumpled dollar bills, but nothing regarding foster homes. "Yes, well, you fell to the bottom of our records," the worker replied. "We only became aware that you're an adoptive household when a service worker remembered the place, and we actually had to dust off your records." Stan grunted, a low sound that was followed with a sip of soda.
"Okay, alright, fine. Guess I'm bringing a kid in here."
Kids, actually," the worker corrected. "They're twins."
"Twins?"
Stan stared in momentary shock before quickly composing himself.
"What does this mean? I've got twice as many mouths to feed?"
"Technically," the worker chuckled, scratching the back of her neck, "they came from a very long line of endless placements after their first home. I know I said overnight, but it'd really help if we could let them stay a while. We were hoping 2 months, perhaps?"
2 months? Are you crazy?
Stan huffed irritably.
"You're saying I'll have children running around here all summer?"
"It's for the best. If you don't like the idea, we can try our best to search for a different placement," the worker assured, but looked like she heavily disagreed on that idea. "But you're our last resort. Otherwise, I'll have to split them as a sibling case." "Maybe I could do that."
"No!
Stan nearly jumped past the door banisters, making the workers lean back in surprise.
Uh, don't separate them. I'll take them.
Oh, are you sure? The worker clutched her clipboard to her chest, and Stan frowned.
Yeah, I mean, I've basically got no choice.
Very well. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, looking momentarily exhausted. I'll see you then. Stan shook her hand, letting his cane lean against the door. She climbed into her car, hightailing it out of the driveway, and disappearing off down the street. Stan huffed, tapping his cane against the porch floorboards, and spending a moment or two pondering.
What a wonderful Sunday morning,
he thought bitterly, throwing his can of soda off the porch and watching it land amidst the grass. Then he turned and slammed the door behind him. The next day, the shack was a bit more harried than usual, and Stan had to shut down tours for the day. He cursed the loss of money, but he knew he needed to make the house presentable for the incoming gremlins. After dusting and mopping and doing more chores in a set of hours than he'd done in his life, he strode into the shop. Seuss was busying himself attempting to fix a light bulb, and Wendy sat at the register, propping her head on her hands and building a little tower of toothpicks.
Wendy,
Stan called, and the red-headed teenager looked up from her handiwork.
Alright, I know this'll probably sound weird, but do you happen to have any clothes for little kids?
Clothes for kids? Wendy sounded bemused, and she swept the toothpicks off the counter with a swift hand. Why? Are you making some other lame attraction?
No. Turns out I'm a foster home buried under the bin.
Stan answered abruptly, shifting a little figurine on the counter.
I got some placements. 2 kids coming in today. Twins, apparently.
Really? Wendy sat up, a smile growing on her face as Seuss turned his head in interest. That's awesome!
Not for my wallet,
Stan glumly replied.
Before they give me any reimbursements, I'm stuck paying out of pocket. So, do you have anything?
I might, Wendy said, looking thoughtful, but it's probably a bunch of flannel. Maybe they're lost and found, Mr. Pines, Seuss suggested, pointing to a lone box in the corner. A lot of kids leave, like, 20 different sweaters in there. And then there's that one kid who always leaves his shoes here. He lives life on the edge. Stan approached the box and rummaged through it, pulling out a collection of colorful sweaters and a blue puffy vest, all in exceptional state.
This'll have to do,
he muttered, and gathered the clothes in his arms and headed for the house. Kids? I've never seen Stan as a guy who'd tolerate kids, let alone foster them, Wendy wondered aloud. Well, you know Stan, Sue stated as he attempted to screw in the light bulb, being rather unsuccessful in doing so. You can't really know him. Wendy shrugged, kicking her feet onto the counter. Whatever. I hope they can play cards. I could use a company. It was nearly 6 by the time the car pulled into the driveway. Wendy had her coat on and a bag slung over her shoulder, but idly sat by the counter in curiosity. Sue stood by the doorway in gleeful anticipation, watching the car with a smile on his face. The car rumbled to a stop and shut off, the front door swinging open. A man and woman stepped out, both donned in dark suits. The man held a manila folder that looked impossibly thick, and the woman still held a clipboard, its papers fluttering in the wind. Stan stood on the front step, leaning on his cane and frowning. He watched as the man stepped around the car and opened the back door. There was a moment of hesitation, and then a head of brown hair popped out. A young boy, no older than 12, stepped uneasily out of the car, like a baby deer. He wore nothing but a dingy hoodie and torn jeans, his sneakers looking about ready to fall apart, and his hair stuck up like he had barely managed to drag himself out of bed. His eyes were wide for only a minute before he caught sight of Stan on the porch. Like a switch had been flicked, the boy's stare morphed into a predatory glare, his hanging mouth curling into a snarl. Stan blinked, wondering what had incited such a change in the boy's demeanor. The social worker stepped back, and the boy reached behind him and finally stepped out fully from the car, a girl latching onto his hand for dear life. Her facial features looked almost exactly the same, and she didn't look much better. She wore a similar gray hoodie, paired with a dingy-looking skirt and muddied sneakers. Her hair was barely accessorized by a faded headband, but otherwise looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. She reached back and removed 2 duffel bags, handing one to her brother, who accepted it and slung it over his shoulders before kicking the car door shut. The two followed the caseworkers up to the house, still hand in hand, like they were each other's lifeline. "Good afternoon, Stanford," one of the caseworkers greeted with a somewhat strained smile. "We've brought the bundles of sunshine. Meet Mabel and Dipper." Stan stared at the 2 kids with identical height, identical build, and the identical doe-eyed look. He returned his gaze to the caseworker.
Didn't think they'd be boy and girl twins.
"Does it matter?" the man stuttered, his brow furrowing in confusion.
Frankly, now I've got to figure the both of them out.
Stan shifted his hat and gestured to the door with his cane.
All right, come on in.
Dipper had to admit, he was genuinely surprised with the new home this time around. He was used to homey-looking 2-story buildings with well-trimmed lawns and a painted exterior that held pure hell within, or trashy-looking buildings with crumbling roofs that showed signs that they'd surely be neglected. He was used to applying these signs to knowing what they would soon be dealing with, and if it be a typical tango of a whirlwind of abuse or a long drawn-out schedule of neglect. But a cabin in the woods? This was something new. He wasn't sure what to make of the man on the porch, but he knew he could easily pass as a drunkard. He needed to find the closet tonight, to hide Mabel in, and let himself fall victim to whatever this man would want. Dipper rubbed his arms, wincing a bit at the pain it caused. The bruises were probably still there, a painful reminder of their previous home. He could still feel the bandages around his left leg, the stitches covered conveniently by the part of his jeans that wasn't torn up. He felt lucky in that, but the man would probably find out soon enough if he was anything like the last home. The car door swung open, and Dipper frowned at the caseworker, who stared back with a bored expression. This was a routine, a nuisance, something that they wanted to get over with. It happened often. Dipper knew that they rushed at getting him and Mabel a home to stay in, and they always ended up with bad places. Or maybe every place was bad. Maybe everyone just hated orphans. He wouldn't be surprised. He'd learned not to trust grown-ups a long time ago. He tentatively stepped out of the car, landing his sneakers on a dirt road. He grimaced, knowing that this would be more wear and tear for his shoes. He didn't have any others, and he would never take Mabel's. He glanced at the man on the porch, trying to catch some type of emotion, but the man looked on blankly, seemingly nearly disinterested. Maybe this would be a neglectful home after all. Or it could all be a facade. Dipper wasn't sure, and it hurt his head. He needed some type of plan, some type of an idea to pull out. Hide and protect Mabel if it was a drunkard? Make himself loud and protect Mabel if it was a beater? Muster up his courage and sneaking skills and protect Mabel if it was a neglector? He glanced at the man, and finally got a reaction. A more surprised reaction than an angry one he'd expected. But it was something. "Dipper?" The boy glanced up at the sound of Mabel's voice, and she held her hand out expectantly, offering a small smile in his direction. She was always encouraging when it came to new homes, and she knew how much Dipper beat himself up, trying to already figure out what they'd be facing. Dipper grasped her hand and pulled her out of the car, and she snatched up their duffels that held a few meager belongings, nothing more than personal items. They only had the clothes on their backs, and they'd lost grooming item privileges months ago. Dipper was all ears, and Mabel was all eyes, just like they planned when it came to new homes, or just new places in general. Dipper strained to pick up every word of the conversations around him, and Mabel swiveled her head, taking in the scenery and the quaint little shop that was accurately named the Mystery Shack. The man seemed even more foreboding up close. Mabel clasped Dipper's hands a little tighter, taking in the man's suit, cane, and weird-looking hat. Maybe he was a businessman of some sorts. She liked the idea. It meant he'd probably just leave them alone. They'd had a man like that once, their fifth out of their altogether 7 homes. They never stayed more than a year in any new foster homes, and that one had been led by a wealthy entrepreneur who spent all day in his office or talking with clients, and all night on his phone. Dipper simply strolled into the kitchen and took food they needed. Never more than simple peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and Mabel was usually always confined to their rooms. They eventually got pulled out of that one for never being sent to school, and none of that man's neighbors had even known he had kids in the house. Dipper was a bit more tense, watching and listening as the man seemed to dislike them already. He invited them into the house, and the workers strolled in. The inside of the place was oddly decorated, with knickknacks on the shelves and a stray can here and there. The living room held a reclining chair and a TV, and then there was a hallway leading to a staircase. It was a small home, and the place didn't seem too messy. Dipper reflexively stood on his toes, breaking his own rule, and trying to take in every aspect of the place. Mabel was shivering a bit, and he squeezed her hand in reassurance. He didn't know what to expect, how to act, how to protect Mabel. He hated these houses the most.
Well, thanks, I guess.
Stan grumbled, scratching his head as the workers finished their spiel.
That's all they've got?
He pointed to the duffels that looked like they barely held anything. You're welcome to buy them more essentials if needed, the woman assured. You will be reimbursed. Eventually. She coughed awkwardly in a fast attempt to change the subject. Paul and I will return within the week to check in and determine whether you'd be fine keeping them, or if we should search for another home. Surely one will open up sometime later.
Ah, whatever.
Stan waved his hand dismissively, knowing his home was probably the best these kids could get right now. Just contact us if there's any trouble whatsoever. Paul handed Stan a flimsy-looking card with the number scrawled on top. And with that, the two left like they had rabid dogs at their feet. The front door slammed behind them, and Stan frowned, reflexively shifting his cane in his hand before glancing at the 2 kids before him. From afar, they had seemed pretty bad, but now, up close, he could see everything. The features of exhaustion, fear, and months, even years of pain and torment. Small scars were evident upon their faces, and their eyes looked hollow almost, like there was nothing there. Definitely not the happiness and fascination a child was supposed to hold. The boy, Dipper, was small and lanky, unnervingly thin, and dirty bandages were wrapped around his fingers. He looked like a deer, alert and eyes flitting across the room for threats. He was even poised on his toes, ready to burst into a run at the slightest sight of danger. The girl, Mabel he thought, was the same size as her brother, but unusually not as thin. She looked relatively fine, compared to her beaten brother, but was shivering and staring with glassy eyes. Her hair was in knots and tangles, with a few evident bald spots. Her sweater had stray threads hanging out, her skirts was torn at the edges, and barely covering the bruises on her legs. Stan had never taken care of kids before, but he knew this wasn't what they were supposed to look like. He knew you had to be a cruel son of a bitch to even think of doing things that led to kids looking like this. He glanced up at Wendy and Seuss, who stared from the door that led into the shack. The kids' injuries weren't visible from afar, but it was obvious they weren't healthy and clean. The fact that these service workers had sent these kids out without so much of a shower made Stan angry already.
So,
Stan scratched his chin, staring down at the children, who peered up with matching doe eyes.
Look, I don't got any spare rooms, but Seuss and I...
Here Stan pointed towards the worker across the room.
Got it all nice and cozy for you up in the attic.
It was like a switch that had been flipped. Dipper bristled, and Mabel slapped a hand over her mouth, like she was struggling just to keep quiet. She began to tremble in panicked fear, and Dipper's hanging mouth suddenly morphed into a snarl, and he nudged his sister behind him. Stan blinked in confusion, but slowly edged towards the stairway.
Sorry kids, but that's all I've got. Unless you prefer sleeping outside or something.
Mabel buried her face into Dipper's shoulder and openly let out a sob. The boy's eyes narrowed, and Stan felt a bit alarmed. Out of all the attractions and freakish things he owned in this place, this one kid was the most aggressive thing Stan had seen in a long while.
Okay.
Stan held up his hands in a placid manner.
I was kidding about outside, but I really do only have the attic for ya.
Whatever. Dipper shifted the bag on his shoulder, and Stan led the way, cautiously. Looking back over his shoulder, Mabel was wiping her eyes, and the two still hadn't let go of each other's hands. There was already the sight of a bumpy road ahead. If Dipper hadn't been confused already, this would have been his breaking point. This man made no sense. Dipper couldn't grasp his character no matter how hard he tried. He usually knew what adults were planning, could tell like it was a sixth sense by the time they were already suited in a room or closet or outside the shack. Whichever place they were dumped in. The man seemed almost as lost as them, like he wasn't well aware of how to be doing things. He just kept tapping that cane of his against a hardwood floor. And then he mentioned the attic. Dipper had been letting his guard down, but once a mention of an attic popped up, he shoved his way forward in front of Mabel and grasped her hand for dear life. Attics weren't good. Attics were punishment. Dipper didn't want Mabel to endure that kind of punishment. He still remembered the stacks of neglected packing boxes, their edges growing with mold, and rats scuttling along smell of decay, and dust in his sinuses, making him gag and cough and struggle to breathe, as his lungs tried so hard to expel the unneeded particles and take in the oxygen he needed. The roughness of the chains against his leg, pulling until the wooden beams shook and he felt like the place was going to cave down on him any minute. And the pain. Dipper blinked hard, shoving away the memory and keeping Mabel behind him. He needed to hide her, place her somewhere safe, or at least away from the attic. The man looked confused, then said something about sleeping outside. Dipper stared with ever-growing bemusement as Mabel began to cry. Dipper wasn't sure if the man meant it or not. The twins had slept outside before, on a cold December night with snow and nothing but a tattered blanket and a couple of pillows between them. He felt a surge of protectiveness run through him at the sound of Mabel's sobs, and he mustered up a threatening glare, not caring if it worsened his punishment later. He could take anything that was meant for Mabel. The man didn't react in the way Dipper would have thought. No harsh slapping or immediate tugging on the hair or yelling not to challenge authority. He just simply turned and headed for the stairs. It wasn't right. It didn't make sense. Dipper followed, still holding on to Mabel, and he was beginning to worry that things were going to become much more complicated. Their dad had been the one to hide his emotions, to act like a wholesome and caring father around other people, but turn into the monster he was later on when they were alone. Maybe that's how this man rolled. Maybe he wanted to seem like he genuinely cared among these other strangers' eyes. Something about a Seuss, and some pretty redhead. Before he got the twins trapped in his mercy, in blissful privacy. They walked up the creaky steps, and Dipper felt Mabel push herself closer to him. Her trembling increased. "It's fine," he whispered before quickly signing it out, speaking a non-verbal language he and Mabel had created by their third home, the one that hated noise. Mabel sniffed, before cringing and glancing at the man in worriment. She shook her head, tears slipping from her eyes, but she didn't let go of Dipper to wipe them away. Dipper placed a hand over his heart, their sign that they were okay, and then they reached a wooden door. Dipper squeezed Mabel's hand. "Wait!" He wanted to scream, as Stan inserted a key into the lock. "Wait, no! I need to hide her! I need to get her away!" The lock clicked, and the door swung open. Mabel flinched by his side, but Dipper remained still, fighting hard not to visibly tremble. Stan led them inside, and Dipper examined the space, actually surprised by what he saw. The place was clean and fresh, lacking of dirt or dust mites, or rats that would nibble at his shoes like he was already food. 2 beds, with matching green covers, sat on opposite sides of the room, with a desk in between, holding a lamp and a few books. The window in between let rays of setting sun stream into the room, illuminating it enough to see a patterned rug. Mabel gasped, slapping a hand over her mouth, immediately and reflexively ducking behind Dipper. The male twin blinked, staring up at Stan and expecting to hear it was a cruel joke.
Ha! You thought this was your room? Oh no. You're sleeping here, in this little space over here, behind this door. Sorry about the cobwebs. I didn't have time to sweep. Ha!
But instead, Stan gestured to the room with his cane.
Well, look alright to ya?
Dipper nodded, slowly and numbly, as Mabel continued to hide behind him.
Good.
Stan looked visibly relieved as he adjusted the fez on his head.
Alright, well, we'll probably get more furniture in soon, and clean up those rafters up there. But for now, there's our beds, and a couple of old books Sue's had lying around. Picture novels or something. I'll let you get settled in.
Dipper nodded again, leading Mabel towards the beds and setting his duffel down on the left one, watching it sink inside itself, barely containing enough items to really even warrant the need of a bag. Stan saw this and clicked his tongue.
Right, I'll be up in a bit, okay? I've got a few things for you.
Dipper froze, and Mabel stiffened, and the door shut behind Stan as he left the room. The twins stood in silence, for what felt like forever before Dipper let out a breath, feeling exhausted and emotionally spent. He rubbed his eyes, and then glanced at Mabel. She swallowed hard, then let go of his hands with maximum effort, nearly having to wrench it away from its tense position. She set her own bag on the bed, and Dipper zipped open his as quickly as possible. He dug through until he found his dagger, lying in the corner of the bag in safety. Mabel watched in knowing silence, sitting herself on the bed with utmost care. Dipper glanced around the room before ducking under the desk and setting his hand on the wall, his fingers trailing over the smooth wood. Without a word and much effort, he scrawled a symbol into the wall, feeling a sense of instant relief before he crawled back out. "I'm scared, Dipper," Mabel stated weakly, drawing her knees to her chest. I don't like Stan. I don't understand what he wants." "Me neither, Mabel," Dipper sighed, tucking the dagger back in his bag. "But we can't leave, not until I get a decent map. Then maybe we can escape." "You've always said that," Mabel muttered, her voice thin and emotionless, as she eased herself into a sitting position, wincing at her bruises, brushing against the comforter. "You've always said we'd escape, but we never have." "We will. This time we will," Dipper urged, climbing onto the beds and sitting in front of her. He almost wanted the words, "I promise," to tumble out of his lips. But he never broke a promise, and if Stan decided to lash out tonight, He wouldn't get to keep his promise. "Alright, now repeat after me, Mabel," Dipper directed, grasping her hands and holding them tight. The two twins sat, facing one another, their clasped hands between each other. This was a routine, their settling in process. Mabel nodded in understanding and waited patiently. "We can't trust any adults," Dipper said firmly, his mouth nearly curling into a snarl. "We can't trust any adults," Mabel repeated. "They're stupid, sadistic bastards who will never help us." Dipper sneered at the thought of Stan and his dad and all the other adults they were dumped into the care of, always being let down. "They're stupid, sadistic meanies who will never help us," Mabel replied. "Mabel, that's not what I said." "I know, but I don't like those words." She offered a shaky smile, and Dipper raised an eyebrow, but shrugged the matter off. Mabel was Mabel, and he'd never discouraged her. "We can't trust anyone," he continued. "We can't trust this guy, his friends, or the workers. We can't trust anyone." His hand slightly shook, and Mabel smiled and steadied them. "Except each other," she recited, "because we always tell the truth, and you look after me, and I look after you, because we're all we have in this world." Dipper smiled, yet he knew he constantly tried to keep her latter statement from occurring as much as possible. He protected Mabel. It had always been this way. She deserved more happiness. She was innocent and sweet and caring, even after all the hell they'd been through. Maybe it was because she realized how little good there was in the world if you didn't squint hard enough to see it. She was as positive as possible, and he saw how much she relied on him to keep the extremely negative things away. He was a monster. He knew it. "Stop it." Dipper blinked, looking up and seeing Mabel slightly glare back. "You're doing that self-loathing thing again, Dip-Dip." "Oh, sorry." Dipper blinked again, feeling like he was out of it all of a sudden. "You're right, we're safe. I've got the symbol drawn down, and I feel all right." "Good." Mabel smiled and Dipper grinned, and he was seriously considering whether to break into laughter or sobs. He didn't get to decide, as the telltale sounds of footsteps were heard past the door. He perked up, sliding off the bed as soundlessly as possible. It had to be Stan. He knew it had to be Stan. "Mabel, I need you to do me a favor," he hissed, nearly yanking her off the bed as well. "Quickly!" The fearful expression returned on her face, and he felt bad in swiping away her small sense of protection, but it was for the best. She nodded, and he gripped her hand and looked around the room before his eyes locked onto the second bed. "Mabel, I need you to get under that bed and stay there, all right? Don't say anything and don't come out. I'll handle this." He watched as she looked wide-eyed, her mouth opening and almost beginning to argue, before she snapped it shut and complied, sliding under the bed in a fluid motion. He watched as she disappeared under the sheets, safe and out of harm's way. With that, he returned his gaze to the door, standing himself as straight as possible and keeping his arms at his side. He could take whatever Stan dished out. End of chapter 1.